Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The House narrowly passed its version of the fiscal 2027 defense policy bill last week, despite strong Democratic opposition over the bill's price tag, the war with Iran, and a provision that would expand military partnership between the United States and Israel. While much of the attention surrounding the National Defense Authorization Act focuses on the bill's massive price tag, foreign policy, and partisan writers, the must-pass package includes several provisions affecting the Defense Department's civilian workforce. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis joins me to break down what measures impacting civilians made it into the bill and what was left out. Anastasia, thanks for being here.
Hi, Terry.
The House NDAA includes a provision for military pay raises. Does it say anything about pay raises for defense civilians?
The House version of the bill includes a 5 to 7% pay raise for service members depending on their rank. And that's in line with the president's budget request. However, just to remind everyone, the Senate's version or the Senate Armed Services Committee's version of NDAA proposed a 3.6% across-the-board pay raise increase. So that's going to be a point of contention moving forward. But for the civilian workforce, the House and the Senate are very silent on a pay raise for civilians. It's not surprising. There is no mention of a pay increase for civilians in the Trump administration's budget request. Civilian pay is addressed outside of the defense authorization process, but some Democrats said it's a really missed opportunity for lawmakers to provide a pay increase for the civilian workforce. For instance, one representative from Maryland voted against the NDAA, saying that this disparity is wrong and that the bill has a massive price tag, and yet there is no money to ensure parity in raises. And he also encouraged the Senate to address this issue, but so far, and again, we only have the Senate Armed Services Committee's version, they've been silent on civilian pay.
Anastasia, were there other provisions that did make it into the bill that would have an impact on the defense civilian population?
I actually wanted to highlight provisions that didn't make it into the bill. So, for example, Republican Representative Glenn Grothman, he offered an amendment that would require DoD to examine options for reducing its civilian workforce by about 200,000 employees. That amendment was rejected. 43 Republicans joined Democrats to oppose it. And let's hear from Glenn Grothman and his explanation of the amendment.
We know that DOJ felt that throughout government, they had unnecessary personnel. And we have all heard anecdotal evidence of people working in a variety of agencies, but particularly the Department of War, who may not be necessary. I'll point out, since I have kind of looked into this, that I have found shocking anecdotes of people working in the private sector, in big companies, who manage to get by doing very little work because the companies are just plain too big and people fall between the cracks. If that's going in private sector big companies, think how much more likely that's happening in a big organization like the Department of War. In any event, right now we're dealing with a situation in which the Department of War is asking for a considerable increase in money, in particular with regard to its authorization bill and also with regard to the other bill that we're going to be trying to be passing this week. So given that, we have to make sure that they're not wasting any money. And I think it'd be a good exercise for the Department of War to say, we've got of these 705,000 people, what would happen if we had to get rid of 200,000? Maybe we'll find they're all necessary, but I don't think so.
And so in 2025, the Defense Department reduced the size of its civilian workforce. I think the number is around 10%. But Terry, you and I have talked about it. And the Government Accountability Office found that the Pentagon didn't really analyze the impacts of these reductions. And they have no plan to assess lessons learned from its 2025 workforce reduction efforts. So that was kind of the opposition to this amendment. Then other amendment that I wanted to highlight that was also defeated was a measure that wanted to strike another provision that bars DoD from using fiscal 2027 funds to implement Trump's executive order that removed collective bargaining rights for civilian workers who work in agencies with national security missions. So that provision is still in the House version of NDAA. We'll see if the Senate Armed Services Committee's version also has this similar language, the same provision, but we'll see if it survives because last year it failed and it never made it into the final version of the bill. So we'll see how that pans out.
Anastasia, as you recite those concerns there, it makes me also wonder whether the bill addresses anything about the ongoing hiring freeze in the Defense Department.
Yeah, so the legislation wants to bar the Defense Department from using its 2027 funds to implement a hiring freeze for a number of different civilian roles. That would include military medical personnel, that would include childcare workers, employees at depots and shipyards. But technically, many of these positions are already exempt under current DoD policy. And also, I wanted to highlight that, interestingly enough, lawmakers want to prohibit DoD from using fiscal 2027 funds to terminate employees in military child development programs, as well as DHA or Defense Health Agency workers and the Department of Defense Education activity workers. I think it's interesting because, we know that a lot of DHA workers left through DRP. They weren't terminated, but they left.
It sounds like there's a lot of effort to protect certain populations within the defense civilian workforce. Are there any efforts on the positive side to reinforce some, like the acquisition workforce? It usually gets quite a bit of attention.
Yeah, definitely. So last year's NDAA was focused on acquisition reform, but they didn't really address the acquisition workforce. This year, the House is addressing the acquisition workforce because the Defense Department's acquisition budgets have grown significantly in recent years. But at the same time, the acquisition workforce has had a lot of challenges, even before the 2025 workforce reductions. So, for example, lawmakers want DoD to have the centralized dashboard. That dashboard would track the acquisition workforce size, its composition, skills, certifications of the workers, vacancy rates, career progression. It would track data on retention, career progression, etc. So that could be helpful. Then they also want DoD to have a new chief acquisition talent officer. That person would be in charge of the department-wide acquisition workforce strategy. And then also one provision that I will highlight is lawmakers want DoD to change how the department evaluates its civilian acquisition workforce. So rather than focusing mainly on acquisition professionals' training and certifications, Congress wants DoD to evaluate them based on how well they apply various innovative acquisition approaches and practices. We'll see how it works out. DoD already has analytics tools to visualize workforce data. DoD already has senior officials to advocate for the workforce. It's interesting that they want to evaluate them based on how well they apply these new acquisition approaches and practices, because are workers equipped tools, to take on a risk? We'll see. We'll see how it plays out.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, thanks for keeping us up to date. There's a lot to watch here.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com.